Hi everyone, this is Red and this is Motion Graphics in Blender. This is not going to be a tutorial because it's really bad time to be making any tutorials for Blender because we're in between versions right now. If I make anything for 2.79, it's going to be obsolete. If I make anything for 2.8, they might change something in the development process and it still might end up being obsolete. So I'm making another video about Blender 2.8 and if it's production ready, as in if you're a small studio, can you count on it? Specifically for Eevee. I haven't tested everything, but I think if you go with cycles, you're fine. But I think Eevee has some issues still that needs to be solved. Now, home stretch coding week is done, and I don't see any improvement on that front. So I need to make this video because I talked to Tom Rosenthal back at Blender conference, and he told me to just be vocal about issues that I find important, and maybe someone's gonna step in and solve those issues. I'm not a developer, so I can't help out. Now, two of the issues, I actually only have two. One is huge, one not so big of a deal, but I would like to see that in as well. Is object-based motion blur and automatically baking IRradiance probes during rendering. So let me explain what I mean by that. Now I'm gonna open a scene in Blender. Here it is. Now this is a scene I've been working on. These are spaceships. They warp in, just a quick scene, and do you see something wrong here? This is where camera is kind of right next to those ships, and motion blur is going on like crazy, and camera is totally static. Look, nothing's going on. I'm gonna go a few frames back, and motion blur is at its maximum, even though nothing should be moving on the screen. So even with camera-based motion blur, there's some issues, but object-based motion blur doesn't even exist. And this is a huge problem. Let me show you why. I'm gonna open another scene. So if I have here this Suzanne model emitting particles, and sorry for my I'm working on a laptop and it's a little bit slow. So let's say we want fire with those sparks, amber I think it's called in English. We would expect them to have some motion blur because they're falling down, but there is no object-based motion blur. Motion blur is enabled here, and sorry, it's not enabled, it's enabled now, and nothing happens. I mean, they're just these dots falling down. So you might think, okay, that's not that big of a deal, but it is a big of a deal if camera moves to the side, because now it takes camera motion and applies this motion blur to these particles, and look how crazy it looks. You would expect these particles to be lines directed downwards toward their motion, but now they're like horizontal lines, and it's super weird to look at. And not only that, if I parent camera to something else, motion blur stops working completely. This is the same thing, it's just the camera is parented to an empty that rotates the camera around this view. So motion blur is really broken down in 2.8. And if you're a studio and you're working and you're counting on this, you started using Blender and you're counting on this new Eevee render engine that you heard so much about, and you create several scenes and you get to like 10th scene that has particles falling down or something where you really need motion blur, and you realize it doesn't work. That's not the reputation we want for 2.8, for Blender 2.8. We need to have it like ready to deal with animation challenges of small studio and big studios as well. So this really needs to be solved. Now, if you open Armory render engine, that is another real-time render engine for Blender. It's been developed by Lobos. He's a great guy. And there is an option to pick between camera motion blur and object motion blur. Now, obviously, there's some issue there. I'm not a developer, so I don't know what the issue is. But obviously, you had to pick between those two. I'm not sure if that's how it behaves in Unity or Unreal render engine, Unreal game engines. But even having this option to switch between these two would mean a lot in any production. So you wouldn't have to just quit on motion blur throughout your project, or decide to just turn it off for this one scene, which would look ridiculous. Now, another thing that I want to show is an issue with IRradiance. IRradiance, what are they called? Probes, right? So here we have a scene with indirect IRradiance probe. I'm gonna select it here so you can see it. This is IRradiance probe. It should pick up the lighting from this emissive object and bake IRradiance for this scene. And I already did that, and as you can see, it behaves kind of, sort of, approximately okay. But if it's an animation where I wanted to start here and move through the scene, now that's gonna be a problem. You see, it's just gonna keep this one frame IRradiance probe bake and not update throughout the animation. Now I understand this might seem like something that I'm asking for too much, but I know this was already in there. About a year ago, I tested some Blender 2.8 builds, and if you had this animated object moving through the scene and you rendered an animation, if you observe the top status bar while rendering, it would say like rendering frame 1. Then before rendering frame 2, it would say updating probes. And it would update these IRradiance probes for each frame. Now, obviously, that's not too much of a problem to put that back in. I don't know, I'm not a developer, but right now it's just gonna keep one frame bake. There is this auto bake button here, but that doesn't do that through rendering animation. It just means that while you're working with this probe, if you change something and you move the probe around, it's gonna update. You don't need to click bake irradiant lighting, but that's not helping us with animation. Now, sure, sometimes you can deal with this by just placing some lights throughout this object, but with some really complex objects, and if you have a lot of emissive materials coming into the scene, leaving the scene, especially if you have some audio visualization stuff, like abstract scenes with a lot of bursting lights, that's gonna be a problem, a huge problem for a lot of people. Now, still, I can live without that in motion, even in motion graphics. I mean, if I take a look at After Effects and Element 3D of something that's industry standard, or maybe even Cinema 4D, if you have real-time rendering, there's usually not gonna be actual irradiance in the scene. You're gonna have to use light. So I can't nag too much about that, but it would be so cool if they could put that back in. I understand that would increase render times, but if it's just a checkbox, that's not gonna be a problem. So those are two issues that really bug me. But the first one with object-based motion blur is really huge one. We need to fix that before Blender 2.8 is officially released in July, I believe. So I think there's still a lot of time. I know they said that they're just gonna fix critical bugs, and this might fall under feature, which they said they're not gonna add any more features. But I think this is super crucial, and I think anyone in animation and motion graphics world is gonna agree with me. So thank you for watching, keep blending, and I'll see you around.